all this change that's clearly absolutely necessary, isn't physical retail space unique in that it's got constraints, it's got landlords, it's got rent demands, it's got local taxes, business taxes, etc. So actually, how much room for maneuver do retailers have in sort of flexing and changing and having this sort of new approach to their physical space? I mean, Jonathan, I guess this is in particular an area you look at a lot.
Yeah. I mean, the scope in many jurisdictions is quite constrained by things like the current taxation regime in particular markets and so on. And the role of the government in this does vary jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So, I'm from the government, I'm here to help, for example, hasn't normally been a refrain often heard in retailing, or indeed welcomed by retailers. Just leave us alone, let's get on with it, But in many jurisdictions, I think in the UK, the availability of grants and loans, furlough payments, tax relief has really helped many retailers, particularly small firms, to survive the pandemic, and that's been seen in a number of geographies. But there's also this issue around what should legislators do in relation to the accelerating changes that we're seeing, and how does that help or hinder retail? And store-based retailers sometimes are asking for online sales taxes, for example. I think you have to be careful what you wish for. There's universal hatred of the UK, for example, for property-based business taxes, which have less and less to do with the nature of retailing and omnichannel. And frankly, for government, it's an easy tax to levy, so they haven't wanted to reform it. But they're going to have to, and there's been a call for online sales tax in many countries. The perception is that online businesses aren't paying their fair share, but of course this is going to affect store-based retailers growing their online businesses. So there'll be a double whammy unless you reform one and replace it with another. And there's a bigger problem here, because the big online businesses are not engaging in tax evasion; they're merely engaging in tax avoidance. It's the international taxation agreements that need to be reformed, and because many of these, our firms are actually US in origin, this quickly becomes, or Chinese indeed, this quickly becomes a geopolitical issue rather than an economic issue. And so the constraints are really far more complex, perhaps, than just seeing it as, well, stop taxing us so much.
Gwen, what's the situation in the US? Well, how much? I presume retailers have greater flexibility in terms of leases have always been turnover based, and different relationships with landlords, possibly, or maybe not true.
Well, we have this phenomenon of now landlords buying retailers that would have gone south otherwise, which is a very, and I question some of that, because you say, are we trying to support an old model so badly that we're going to sink more money into a ship that has already sunk? I think that's a challenge. So a lot of moving parts at once, obviously. These, from a practical matter, I think, we have to, all this kind of looking at taxation and issues like that become kind of a complicated web. The point was be careful what you wish for, because now all retail is becoming, I'll call unified commerce. So you're not looking at, this bricks and mortar versus online. It's going to become more continuous. So, pointing to the people who shouldn't be able to, be in retail, or they're making their money in another part of their business. I mean, look, Amazon is famously, not really performed on the retail side of their business, but it's customer acquisition and cloud services. So the models are shifting dramatically in terms of where the relationship is between, on the financial side, landlords are having to contend with having to look at different models for getting, compensation, relevant, return based on the retailer performance. And then we're looking at medical centers coming into malls, and totally different types of businesses that sign leases and, very different kinds of property agreements that will all make mixed use properties that are more appealing moving forward, and integrating residential even into that. So I think it's really an interesting time on that sense and on that front. And yes, a lot of the regulations and things and even the both local politics, national and globally, are going to have to reform pretty drastically to support retail.
Yeah. Alan and also Andrew, you've had a lot of experience working in Asia. Just what does the situation compare like to Western Europe and North America in terms of the constraints on sort of physical retail? I mean, I'm guessing this is from very little knowledge that Asia has more flexibility built into it for retailers to move around and downsize and upscale or whatever. Would that be true?
Yeah, I think it probably is. And I was thinking back to, the last of the World Retail Congresses that I was physically able to attend in was Amsterdam in 2019, where inevitably when a lot of retailers get together, they talk about landlord relationships in the way that when farmers get together, they talk about the weather. And I think, back in 2019, getting on for 2 years ago now, there was inevitably again a sort of fairly unanimous view that the relationship between retailers and landlords really had to change, and that the tenancy arrangement needed to better reflect the realities of retailers in terms of where their revenue was coming from, increasingly online, and the role that those stores were playing, contributing to sales, but were not necessarily the fulfillment point for the sale. And I think nearly 2 years on, we're at a point where that now looks compellingly obvious. And clearly, given the amount of pain that there is amongst a lot of store-based retailers, I think there's a compelling case to say that there will be, and there already is, even more pain amongst the landlords that are hosting those store-based retailers. Most evidently in the UK, we've seen into collapse under an utterly unsustainable mountain of debt. In Gwen's geography, as we were exploring earlier, the US went into this looking even more overshot than the UK, and I think that those activities of a number of US landlords in buying into retail, it really feels rather short term, and it feels like an effort to just plug a few more holes that would otherwise have emerged into those mouths. So I think that there is a realization now that the landlord-retailer relationship simply has to change to something that is rather more reflective of the very changed realities of physical retail, both in the amount that's required and in the function that it's playing. But yes, I think to your question, that usually there is rather more flexibility in retailers' room to maneuver in most of the Asian countries than there is in the models we've grown up with in the West.